All right, I guess we'll get started. Thank you everybody for joining. We'll see if more people trickle in as we go through, but we're very excited to present this webinar to you and have an open discussion with everybody here. We have some expert presenters and expert AppSec people that have been doing this for a long time. To talk about the different aspects of using a multi-layered approach to really maximize the effectiveness of AppSec testing. And we'll talk about some different ideas, some conflicting ideas here. We'll probably argue a bit amongst ourselves just to have some fun with it. But I think that coming away from this, you'll gain a lot of interesting aspects and understanding on different things that can be done. And obviously, we are all available, as you'll see at the end, for follow-up, for any questions that you have, or if you'd like to talk about these things in more detail after the event. So we'll start with quick introductions of who we are and why are we talking about this topic. Then we'll go into the AppSec landscape and what is the latest research showing us on the adoption of different AppSec solutions, the integration between those different AppSec solutions, etc. We'll talk about the different testing tools as unique components or unique tools, so we get an understanding of how they work as individual tools, and then we'll start talking about the challenges and the best practices around integrating those various tools and how you can get more benefit by integrating multiple tools. Then we'll have an open discussion, and as part of that, we will also start addressing your questions. So with that, we have a Q&A button that you can see on your panel. There's a chat, which many of you have already used to share where you're located. Feel free to post questions in the Q&A and in the chat. We will monitor them and either answer them live as they come up in the discussion, or table them for more of the open discussion that we will have later. But really, trust me, the panelists and I have already seen all the questions, have gone through the slides, so this really is for you. Please post questions, post your comments so we can address them and make this more interactive and more informative for everybody. With that quick introduction, we have 4 people on the panel today joining me, and we'll get into a more detailed introduction of each of us in a second. But honored to have Jeff Williams, founder and CTO of Contrast. He has been doing this for a long time and has some great perspectives on why Contrast was started in the first place, the whole notion of IAST, why it exists, what the benefits are, but he'll also talk about many other things. Kunal had joined us today from Mumbai. He's usually based here in the Bay Area. But he heads up AppSec at SentinelOne, which is an amazing company, as you all know, and obviously security is very, very important for a cybersecurity like SentinelOne. Itai joins us from Israel, and he is the CISO of Outsier. Outsier is one of the RSA companies, and he has very strong opinions about many things. Most of them are actually based on fact and experience, so looking forward to hearing from him. And I am Gadi. I am the CEO at Bright Security and have been doing AppSec or cybersecurity for a very, very long time. So excited to be here. With that, I'll quickly turn it over to Jeff, if you want to introduce yourself a bit and tell us a bit more about yourself.
I think you did a pretty good job there. So I got started in AppSec in the late 90s, and I had the privilege of working with lots of really big organizations on their AppSec programs, lots of large financials, government, healthcare, power companies. And I think, I've had the experience of working as a consultant for many years. I've tried many different approaches to application security, many different kinds of applications, and I've learned a lot across the way. And That's sort of what pushed me towards inventing IAST and RASP and bringing those to market. And so that's my latest venture is contrast security, where we're the leading vendor of IAST and RASP and runtime security solutions.
Perfect. Great to have you here. Itai.
Hi guys. As Gadi said, my name is Itai. I'm the CISO of OutSeer, part of our security. The older guys from you will remember this company, kind of a blast from the past. Prior to OutSeer, I was the CISO of Cellbrite. If you don't know the company, that's great. I mean that you did not committed any crime. Cellbrite is working with law enforcement by collecting digital intelligence. So good for you if you don't know. Prior to that, I was the head of threat research at Insights that was acquired by Rapid7. I think it was 3 years ago. Prior to that, KPMG and many others. I won't go through the entire career, but I'm in cybersecurity business for a long time, almost 20 years now. Well, getting old. Way before, by the way, it was called cybersecurity. It was just information security, like 6 years ago, but we rebranded. Anyway, glad to be here and looking forward to this one.
Excellent. Thanks, Itai. Kunal, definitely the most trendy of all of us.
Hi everyone, I'm Kunal. I've been in the software industry for a little over 2 decades, trying my hand at different things, being a builder, did some production support, was a DBA, was a sysadmin, and finally moved to security. I think having done all these different hats, it put me in a good spot to actually understand security from the developer perspective. Um, in the security space, I've mostly worked on application and product security and all flavors of bug bounty, including building our own bug bounty program at one of the companies that I used to work at. And I've mostly worked in fintech, a little bit of insurance, and of course, the cybersecurity industry as well. In my spare time, I enjoy running, swimming, just a whole bunch of different things. Very happy to be here.
Excellent. Great to have you. And then quickly about me, started my way in cyber about 25 years ago, originally from Israel, but have been in the US for the last 20-ish years, and slowly evolved from the areas of voice over IP encryption. For those of you who remember that was all the fad in the early 2000s or late 90s, and got into application security later in life. So very happy to be here. Very happy to be hosting this this webinar. And let's dive right in. As a reminder, please, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A, post them in the chat. Let's have a discussion and understand what is top of mind for all of you and how we can look at it. This is a Gartner slide. Actually, most of the landscape information I'll be showing comes from Gartner, and it's looking at the broader view of security in the software development lifecycle. They call it CNAP. They call it all sorts of names depending on the flavor of the month or the week. It's an ever-evolving notion or ever-evolving concept. But you can see that as they look at the overall security of the software development lifecycle, there are a lot of different components that fall into it, where application security is taking a key role, but it is one of the pieces in the broader picture of making sure that everything really is secure around the software development lifecycle. I'm not going to talk about all of the different aspects here, but I thought it was important to show where application security fits into the broader world. And we'll talk today about SAST and DAST and IAST and RASP and how they all fit in and how they all collaborate or communicate. But as you are thinking about your broader strategy of protecting your entire development lifecycle, there are a lot of other areas to focus on. And you as an organization need to understand what are the most critical components for your organization based on your specific or unique development environment. Not all of these things will be relevant for every environment. It's important that you understand what the emphasis is for you based on the specific footprint of how you develop, what your applications are, and what you expose to the world that can be accessed. Today, we will focus on this specific section. It's not a small section, right? When we look at application security, again, this is based on recent Gartner research, we're looking at an industry that was about $3.4 billion in 2022. It was smaller in 2021, and it's predicted to grow by 27% annually through roughly 2030. So we're looking at a segment that will go from about 2.6 billion to more than 5 or 6 billion within less than a decade. And there's a good reason for that. The reason for that is that organizations are releasing more and more applications. They're releasing more and more APIs. As we move into higher velocity deployment and development by organization, using DevOps, using modern development strategies, they are releasing a lot more applications, APIs, and microservices into the world. And that means that the attack surface is growing significantly. This is still the number one place where organizations are vulnerable and are prone to attacks. And that's why this industry and this market is growing so significantly. So if we look at the broader picture, it looks like a small component, but when you zoom in, you understand that it's a very, very significant component of that overall environment. If we double click one step further, this is research that has not been published yet. So we got a sneak preview and we're sharing it with you here. It will be published by Gartner in an April or May timeframe. But they did an analysis of the different solutions that companies are actually deploying in the AppSec space and what percent of companies that they researched are deploying the various solutions. And you can see that static analysis is most broadly deployed. So 43% of organizations that are utilizing an AppSec solution are utilizing static analysis. And you can see that they're looking at API security testing tools, container security, then dynamic application security, infrastructure as code, and going forward through IAST and the other tools that we have discussed. That does not mean that there isn't an overlap between some of these tools. So as an example, AI-based tools, right, does overlap because there are DAST tools, there's IAST tools that are AI-based. So there is an overlap between these different categories. There are also vendors that sell multiple categories here and deploy solutions across multiple categories. But we thought it was very interesting to see what the dominant categories are, where organizations are focused, and making sure that we track this over time. Because if with those of us who have looked historically, we can see a shift in the trends here, where if you go back 10 years, there were other solutions that were dominant at that time. 5 years later, that map shifted, and 5 years later, that map shifted again. One of the amazing things about a market that grows as fast as this market has been growing, which is 27% year over year, is that these shifts can happen very, very quickly based on the real attack surface and the real vulnerability areas that organizations will have, and the value that the various solutions provide. And that's why that integrated strategy that we will talk about today is so important. All right. So with that, what I'd like to do is dive into the specific solutions, and in the order that you just saw them, start by talking about static analysis. And Kunal, Itai, would you guys like to jump in on this one and talk a bit more about your deployments of static analysis and what you've seen?
Sure, absolutely. Stat is, I mean, for me, is the most basic format of AppSec as a part of the SDLC. You have advantages and a lot of disadvantages, and I'm pretty sure all of you will agree. I mean, yeah, you can scan everything over and over. The problem is you get tons of false positive. I mean, at least this is my problem. I mean, like, I'm not talking about 1 or 2% of false positive. I'm talking about like 30% of false positive, just because does not really scan everything or the deployment or the app or just the code. It just scans the folders, the libraries, and that's it. Doesn't really matter if, I mean, our type of deployment in the app is not vulnerable, or we have taken into consideration other things. I mean, one major case, I'm pretty sure you all remember Log4j. Still, people have, still recovering from that, at least from us. And we did the test, by the way. I won't say who's the vendor. Just going to say same color as Sentinel-1, but I won't get into the actual color, the actual vendor. If you add a folder with the name Log4j, he will automatically just find the name and present that the folder is vulnerable. It's not, I mean, one of our problems, it's not really scanning everything. You just locate the folder, and if you see the name, it's vulnerable. I mean, for us, it was kind of a funny because we have disabled it. We didn't delete it. We just disabled it, and it still keeps showing it's vulnerable. So this is my problem. It's that, I mean, the other problem is I don't have another solution to replace it. I mean, to say I don't need that, I don't have anything good enough to replace it at the moment. Well, what do you think?
Kunal, anything to
Yeah, I
add
think-
about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with what Itai is saying. Basically, I'd like to divide the SaaS into two buckets. One is the pure SaaS, which is the developer written code. And second is the SCA category, where developers use libraries. I was reading some numbers, I think maybe 6 months back. Around 70% of the code that's written is basically calling different libraries. So, and these libraries may be calling other libraries and so on and so forth. The issue of false positive definitely exists. And kind of touching upon what Itai talked about earlier about uh, including reference to vulnerable libraries, Log4j being definitely the most famous one. A lot of these tools basically look for instances where the libraries are used, not necessarily whether they're the specific function is being called. Um, that definitely adds on to the problem. But having said that, it's definitely table stakes whenever you start an AppSec program for application security. If you're talking about application, definitely need to be looking at code, definitely need to be closer to the developers. And SAST is something for most companies that I've worked on. The developers are the ones who actually look at the issues, if they do look at the issues, that is. And it's easier to integrate into the CI/CD pipelines. Um, but yeah, that's the absolute table stakes.
Perfect.
I agree. I mean, the best part is in the deployment. I mean, at least in Outsi, what we did, we nominated a security champion from the R&D team, from the engineering team. He is responsible for that, and also the team leaders from the R&D. So they are responsible to look at the findings and work with our AppSec in order to validate them. First phase is validate, prioritize, and then start actually fixing them and put them into the API.
Excellent. Good. So let's move on from static analysis to dynamic. Maybe I'll talk about that one because that's what we we do at Bright. I think the key things regarding dynamic is it helps address some of these questions or some of these issues that Kunal and Itai brought up. And that is if dynamic is done correctly, then you have a much lower degree of false positives. You might not find as many vulnerabilities because you're focused on only vulnerabilities that exist in the compiled environment or in a production environment, and only those, that's why it's called black box texting, right? Only those vulnerabilities that can be accessed or can be found by a hacker that's trying to access your environment. So you'll find less, but also if done right, you'll have way fewer false positives. It shows you the actual attack simulation that can happen. And again, if done right, you can get proof of vulnerability and you can show the developers, this is how this vulnerability can actually be exploited. So it's much easier to take action and make sure that you're remediating the vulnerabilities early on. There are more and more trends towards shifted left DAST or developer-centric DAST, where you can implement DAST earlier in the development lifecycle. That's definitely what we promote and what our customers are doing. And we think that with that, there is more value of finding vulnerabilities, real vulnerabilities early, and making sure that they are remediated early in the development lifecycle. So DAST takes a different approach to static analysis. And with that, I'll shift it over to Jeff, who invented IAST and can tell us a bit more about IAST. And Jeff, if you want, spend a couple of minutes talking about RASP as well, because I think it's important in this context.
Sure. Yeah, so IAST is one part of runtime security. So runtime security is the bigger category. IAST stands for Interactive Application Security Testing. And it was created to deal with a lot of the kinds of problems that you just talked about, speed and accuracy problems with SAST and DAST. And remember, SAST and DAST came out of in the early 2000s, and they haven't evolved a ton since then. If I had to frame it up, I would say SAST is kind of theoretical. It's shifted too far left and doesn't have much context. So you end up with lots of false positives. DAST is outside in and lacks a lot of context because it can't understand what's going on inside the running application very well. So you end up with a lot of false negatives. IAST works differently. IAST, you install an IAST engine on your workloads, and it works like an APM tool, like a New Relic or an AppDynamics. It instruments the application with security sensors that can observe it as it runs. This provides a lot more context. IAST can see the code, it can see the HTTP traffic, it can see the data flow, control flow, all the open source libraries, even the app server and the framework configuration, all the backend connections. And so with all that context, you can find vulnerabilities without even having to exploit them. So it's like DAST in the sense that it works on a running application, but because it's inside, it can just detect the vulnerability. It doesn't have to exploit it, which makes it a lot more efficient. IAST also traces vulnerabilities to the exact line of code so that, with DAST, you only get an HTTP request that says, hey, the vulnerability's in there somewhere. With IAST, you can see, exact line of code, exact data flow as it propagated through the application and so on. So to use IAST, really, you just install it once, and then you run your normal test cases, your normal use. You can even use it in production if you want. IAST is just sitting in the background, analyzing the application as it runs and reporting vulnerabilities in real time. So there's no scanning, there's no extra steps, and it works forever. Like you don't have to go back and scan it again in a month. It just lives there forever. And one of the cool benefits that I didn't think of really when we started out with IAST was that it's totally distributed. So it's extremely scalable. We just worked with a customer that put IAST on 700 applications And in a matter of days, they had complete results for all 700 applications, and they'll have those results forever going forward. So it's very fast to deploy and efficient because it's a totally distributed solution. So you asked about the other parts of runtime security. So IAST is one part. Runtime SCA is another part of runtime security. IAST typically it comes with SCA. We actually analyze the whole application all at once, which I think is the right way to do things. You don't want to analyze your custom code and your libraries separately because they're all mixed together at runtime. And almost all vulnerabilities involve both custom code and library code. So by being able to see the whole thing, you can be much more accurate. So that's IAST runtime SCA. And then the third piece is runtime application self-protection, or RASP. And RASP works essentially the same way. It just takes it one step further and prevents vulnerabilities from being exploited. So if you look at, most of the major CVEs that have come out, the big popular CVEs that have come out over the past couple of years, like Log4Shell and Atlassian flaws and Spring and so on, RASP has prevented all of those vulnerabilities from being exploited, as well as preventing your own custom code vulnerabilities from being exploited. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in your program if you can deploy with vulnerabilities and have protection. I still think you should go back and fix those vulnerabilities, but it gives you a lot of flexibility if you've got that extra layer of protection, and it goes way beyond what a WAF can do because it's inside the running workload. So that's runtime security. Is IAST, RASP, and runtime SCA rolled into one thing.
Very cool. Excellent. Again, I'm reminding everybody, I'm seeing some questions starting to trickle in, but feel free to post any questions you have, because now we're starting to shift into the real fun. Now that we've revved our engines a bit and talked about the different solutions in the landscape, let's start talking about some common challenges with integrating AST and running AST solutions within your environment. Right? There's a lot of aspects that are related to this. We're seeing that a majority of organizations, if you remember that chart of the 43%, the 37%, et cetera, obviously a majority of organizations are running multiple solutions. And if you're running multiple solutions, you want to get the value of the integration between the various solutions. And we're looking at different areas that have complexity. One is the integration, and we'll dive into that in a second. Workflows between the applications. We'll talk about some of the challenges there, but also some of the really cool solutions that we're seeing customers deploy in order to get more benefit from various solutions. And then obviously we're getting into the problem of skill sets and training of people. So if for those of you who remember the age-old consulting mantra of people, process, technology, this is exactly it. We're talking about technology in integration, we're talking about process and workflow, and we're talking about people in skills training. So exactly the three areas of challenges that many organizations are facing. And I'd like to open it up mainly for Kunal and Itai, who are really the practitioners here, to talk about some of the best practices they've seen and what helps address some of these challenges.
Yeah, I think when we talk about AppSec, right, the first word that comes to mind is basically shift left. And the term is used to a point where some people say it's overused. But essentially, the idea of shift left is to be able to detect issues as soon as possible. I keep telling fellow practitioners that, or even developers for that matter, is when you are envisioning an application, building an application, you're putting the boxes there, the architecture in place. That's when I want to be talking with you. Now, that doesn't happen in real life for the most part. But the next best step is basically, once you have the code written, I want to be running the SAST and the other tools, which basically look at scanning the code itself. And then you go on shifting from left on to the right. Now, I think some of the fellow practitioners here talked about false positives and false negatives. There are benefits to both, whether you use SAST or whether you use at the extreme end DAST or even pen testing for that matter. It reminds me of that old parable where five blind men were standing in front of an elephant at different places. One person was standing at the back, and they all had uh, different way to describe the elephant. In my opinion, the reason I think the previous slide you said that 71% of the organizations were using different set of tools. I think it's a combination of all the different tools which give you the best perspective and which helps you make an informed decision. You definitely need the context. You also need to be able to find those ahas as early as possible. So it's a combination of all of these approaches that has worked for me in all the different organizations that I have worked in.
Very cool.
I'm 100% agree. I mean, finding the problems early as possible is the key here, and finding the right problems is even a bigger key. Because and especially Kunal, you work with big teams. Yeah, I mean, SentinelOne is a big R&D company. At the end, I think more than half of the employees are developers, and every time I have to sit with our developers and presenting, we got hundreds of vulnerabilities that scan, and just realize, I mean, everybody's working for weeks, and then we realize from 100 only 10 are valid. I mean, sometimes it feels like a big waste of time of doing the validation. I mean, this is one way to look at it, but obviously, as I said, there is no better way today of doing that. Part of the drill, by the way, in our AppSec program, we put a mandatory training once a quarter for all developers. I mean, like with exercising on a real code. It's kind of a simulation of the code, the whole system. At the end, I mean, everybody hates processes because it looks a little boring, but I think at the end, this is the key: work systematically, check, validate, and fix. I mean, there is no other way, at least that I'm familiar with.
Very cool. Yeah, I think one of the things I'm hearing, and I see a couple of questions posted, so we'll talk about those in a second because they're relevant for this discussion. But I think one of the things we are seeing more and more is, yes, organizations want to shift left and integrate into the software development lifecycle and do it early. But the big question that's coming up is, A, how far left do I shift? And B, what is the impact on my developer time? Because you're starting to get into very complex calculations around how much time am I actually taking away from my developers to chase ghosts and chase false positives, and how do I make sure that they're looking at real vulnerabilities and fixing the real vulnerabilities? And this is where application security posture management is supposed to help. Our belief is that calling it shift left is an incorrect statement. That's why we call it dev-centric, because you need to have an approach that provides the tools directly into the developer's hands and gives the developers the tools to take action early. And that is very important around the area of automation, which is the second point that we have here, to make sure that developers don't have to do anything proactively in a manual way. You need to automate this process, but you also need to have the policies that define these could be in different extremes. It could be a policy that says developers have no control. We define the rules as AppSec of, if you have these specific vulnerabilities, you have to remediate them, and only then can you push things into production. Or alternatively, other organizations give developers a lot more control. And you need to make sure that you have that collaboration between the AppSec team and developers. So Itai mentioned to have the training between the teams, etc., to make sure that we're speaking the same language. Because a lot of time what's happened is we're not even speaking the same language between AppSec and developers, and that's causing a lot of the breakdowns. Maybe
Hey,
before we, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
was just going to say, I hear about a lot of pushback to the idea of shifting left. I hear it from customers, and I'm even hearing it from analysts now, that I think many organizations have tried it and found that it just doesn't work for some of the reasons that Itai was talking about. If you take tools that were designed for security teams and push them onto development teams that aren't ready for them and don't have the processes to run them effectively and deal with false positives and do that triage effectively, and pardon my language, but I think this is just too funny. I think it's shitting left. It's not really shifting left effectively. And left to right doesn't really matter that much. If your pipeline is, running 15 minutes, or, you're running your pipeline multiple times a day, left is a matter of hours. And so I think what's much more important is what you were getting at, is like shifting to the place where it's most efficient for your teams to deal with challenges. That might be the easiest, the most accurate, might be the most cost effective. It might be the most fun place to do application security, but that's where you should shift to. And left right is not a significant factor in the decision, in my opinion.
Yeah, makes sense. Good. So actually, you were touching on a couple of the questions that were posted. And Jeff, I see that you answered the first one, but maybe we'll elaborate on it a bit more and share.
Yeah.
Donald asked, so to deploy IAST or RASP, an agent is deployed on the individual application, or does an agent need to be deployed on the individual application? I'm sure that others are interested in that. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, that's right. You install IAST and RASP and runtime security on the workloads themselves. Typically, what people do is they make it part of their standard platform, whether it's a gold server or a container or a Kubernetes environment. They install a runtime security that way and push it onto a lot of applications at once. It's not a traditional agent that most people think of. It's, most people think of agents running at the operating system level, like XDR and so on. But runtime security works at the application layer. It's really just another library that you make it becomes part of your applications. So it runs in the application space. They're very high performance, and so you probably won't even know that it's there during your QA process or in production.
Excellent. Good. And then another question we had from a very secretive anonymous attendee was around shifting or implementing DAST into the software development lifecycle and running it early. So maybe I'll answer that with an example, right? Because that's what we do at Bright. The problem and the reason we actually created the company originally, we talked to a lot of organizations that told us the problem we have is we already have static analysis, we already have dynamic analysis and other tools, but when we run static analysis, there's a lot of false positives, and we don't really know which of those vulnerabilities exist or will exist in a production environment and which won't. So the developers end up spending a lot of time chasing ghosts and trying to find which of those vulnerabilities are real and which are not. With the dynamic analysis tools, by the time we run them, it's too late because we run legacy dynamic tools in pre-production. We find the vulnerabilities, but we've already pushed into production because we shifted into DevOps practices and we are deploying very, very quickly, and AppSec just can't keep up. That means that if we've already deployed to production, there is a magic number of 1 to 60 ratio. If you find a vulnerability early in the development lifecycle and you're able to fix it at that point, it will take you a 60th of the time versus if it's made it into production. Many reasons for that. Happy to discuss them in more detail, but I won't get into that here. But that means that almost 90% of organizations historically were saying that they are knowingly deploying vulnerable applications and APIs into production because they find the vulnerabilities, but they don't have time to fix them. And that's where shifting DAST left or doing developer-centric DAST is very valuable, because you won't find everything early. But let's say you find 60% of the vulnerabilities early, and those are the high and critical ones. That's where you'll get a lot of value, because you'll be able to fix them early. And these will be true and validated vulnerabilities that the developers will get proof of vulnerability for and remediation guidelines so they can fix them quickly. So that addresses the question. I see that Kunal and Itai have both added a lot more insights here, which is great. Anything else to add around the best practices, team? If not, we'll move on to the next area. We have a lot more content to cover. And we'll continue addressing the questions as they come in. I see a few more coming in, so we'll address them as we move forward. But now we're starting to break down the common challenges, and really looking at the different areas, the people, the process, the technology that we talked about earlier. Itai, Kunal, again, we'd love to hear from the practitioners. Any other thoughts or points regarding these specific areas that are listed here?
I mean, I think it's covered in the slide, pretty much the challenges. Integration is definitely a challenge in the sense that I think Jeff touched upon it a little bit when he talked about context. The more you go to the left, there is definitely lack of context. So the holy grail for me is basically when you're able to combine both the left, right, center, whatever you want to call it, and get the context and then give a unified result, which is what the ASPMs of this world are trying to do. But it's definitely not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think one of what I see here is is the main challenge is how to work with your R&D team. Eventually, you want to bring them to the table. It's not just a security problem. It's not a cybersecurity problem. It's a whole company problem. And eventually, if you manage to bring them and train them and support them in this challenge, I mean, this is, for me, this is the biggest challenge in that field. Once you have R&D onboarded, the engineers, I mean, supporting them, that's the easy part. But you have to bring them to the table. You have to teach them and show them eventually what are the problems. And they need to understand them, because in many cases, R&D sees the problem. We see a finding, said, okay, we'll fix it in some point. A organization that under heavy regulation needs to fix things and quickly. Other organization, it can wait. Why? Because R&D have other tasks, they have other priorities at the moment. So building that priorities, bringing this process on board the R&D is a part of the security. Make it, I won't call it their problem, but their business, part of their goals. I think this is the key here.
I think what I see in organizations is if they're using legacy tools like SAST and DAST, what ends up happening is they generate a backlog, exactly like you're saying. They can't triage things fast enough, so they have to do something with those findings. So they generate a big pile of vulnerabilities, and sometimes they manage that in some system that they've established. Sometimes they have an ASPM kind of tool, but it's really, the problem then becomes managing the backlog and gardening the backlog. I encourage you to ask companies that you talk with, how big is your application security backlog? It's often hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, often millions of vulnerabilities that are just sitting in some database not getting fixed. And the problem has to do with sort of humans in the loop. We can't triage fast enough to deal with SAST. We're not getting the good vulnerability coverage with DAST. It's difficult to correlate those two things to match them up. So you end up with just a big pile of work for humans, and that doesn't scale to modern software development speeds. That's where I think IAST can really accelerate things because it's more accurate and because it's a lot faster. In most cases, we've cut the security team out of the feedback loop, can take results directly from IAST directly to development teams, and they can fix them immediately.
Yeah, very cool. I think another example, similar example, but addresses both of the points that Kunal and Itai raised is we're seeing more and more of our customers integrating static analysis tools with our DAST. And the process that we're seeing, and it's a great example that I have from a real customer where the process is static analysis provides us an API that gives us all the vulnerabilities that it found in a specific application. We run targeted validation scans, and I won't get into the technical details on how we do it, but it's a pretty elaborate process to just validate those vulnerabilities that were found. And in that example, for a healthcare customer, static analysis found 120 vulnerabilities. We were able to run validation scans and find 80 of those 120. So to Jeff's point, there's 40 out there that we said we can't find them. If you want to spend the time in the AppSec team to validate them, great. Go ahead and research them. We're tabling those for now. Out of the 80 that we were able to validate, we were able to provide proof of vulnerability for 20 in a production environment. So say these actually exist, and here's the proof that they exist. And out of those, 12 were real high or critical vulnerabilities. So in an automated way, we're able to narrow it down from this is 120 to the 12 that the developers really need to focus on and fix immediately. And that reduces a lot of the noise for developers. And then if AppSec has the time, they can go ahead and research all the others and decide what action to take. But at least you're not wasting the developer time and you're focusing them from the beginning on the most critical aspects.
I agree, Gadi. I think that the fact that there is a vulnerability, it's not there, you find it or you don't find it, I think it's not the key. The key is to find vulnerabilities that are exploitable in real time. I mean, this is the key. I mean, I'm pretty sure every code, especially, I mean, if I look at our code base, this is a 22 years old company. So you can imagine some of the code is kind of written a long time ago. So sure, we're going to have thousands or hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities. At the end of the day, I don't care if it's unexploitable. For me, I can put it on the side and work on the things that actually are exploitable. I mean, at least this is what matters to me. I prefer to fix those. And I think this is the key. I mean, vulnerabilities, you can have hundreds of thousands or even more. It depends how big, how much code you have and how old it is. But fixing by priority, I mean, the key to prioritize them is severity and is it exploitable or not. I mean, you don't want to waste time, get a lot of time from the R&D team. So eventually you will have time, you'll get their commitment, but it will be very limited. So you'll need to manage that time carefully, and you want to fix the things that are more important.
Yeah, perfect. And I think we actually already talked about we talked about most of this slide, but if you look at or the main point to make here, and again, Kunal, Itai and Jeff, feel free to jump in, but the main point is if you are looking to implement AppSec solutions, A, we think that's mandatory, and B, it's very, very important that you take those AppSec considerations or cyber considerations into consideration. as part of your entire software development lifecycle. So you want to make sure that from the point you're designing your applications, you're already taking AppSec into consideration, or API security, and you're implementing it throughout the entire development lifecycle, and whichever tools make sense at that point, or whatever integrations between those tools make sense at that point, you are considering them so you're most effective. I see that there are a bunch of other specific IAST questions. So I think, Jeff, you can follow up on those directly. I see that you're already answering them. But anything to add here, Itai or Kunal, regarding the deployment throughout the SDLC and using the right tools at every step?
It's not that something is missing, just this is, I won't call it boring, but this is the long version. The end. Yeah, we can break it out. Same as here, but eventually it's, designing components. I mean, finding things that needs to be part of doing the scan in real time every time that code is being deployed. Every time you developer push commit, you scan it, find vulnerabilities, and start building the pipeline. I mean, start building the backlog, then work with the product, and start fixing. And this is kind of a very vicious cycle that eventually, I mean, you end up with a lot of findings. Very few of them eventually get fixed. I mean, the critical ones, at least, you try to focus on the criticals, and on top on everything. And I think this is not really, it is here, but training is, at least as I see it, is crucial, because I think by training you can reduce by a lot. And I mean, you have a few benefits. You reduce the amount of vulnerabilities because people actually learn something from those trainings. Second thing, you create awareness and you make your R&D team aware of security and make them more commit and understand why we're doing this. Because usually most of the pushbacks is why we need it. It's not our job. We have other priorities. I mean, you get excuses from here, at least from Israel until California and back. Of why not to. Awareness, help them to understand why, and help management to understand why.
Yeah, you're really talking about that common language that we said was very, 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 very important to make sure that we're not talking at each other, but we're talking together. I think that's very important.
Exactly.
Excellent. Any other points by any of the panelists? Anything else you think we missed that we should bring up before we share our contact details and people can follow up with us directly regarding the specific discussions?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. I think it's great discussion about different techniques for doing application security testing. But I want everybody to remember there are things that no automated AppSec testing tool can test for. Typically, that's things like authentication flaws, access control flaws, maybe encryption issues. There's a number of things that are mostly custom implemented by applications, and so they're very difficult to automate the testing for. And one of the things we're trying to do with the runtime approach is not try to find those problems automatically, but make them visible. So we started this effort towards security observability, where we're going to generate, we are currently generating a security blueprint for each application that will show you, hey, here's all the routes, here's the security defenses that are applied to each route. Like, these are authenticated, these are unauthenticated, these have access control checks, what role they're checking for. The bad things that happen along those routes, like the dangerous stuff, command execution, backend connections, and so on. And then the actual backend connections that get formed. And our goal here is to make it possible for teams to look at that data and say, hey, why is this route unauthenticated? Instead of having, to pay a pen tester or a security code reviewer to go through and find those issues, we can make them visible. We can't automatically identify the problem, but we can make it way easier for a development team to just look at it and say, hey, that doesn't look right. So just something, it's kind of expanding
Very
the
cool.
scope of AST into some of those areas that have traditionally not been possible.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we hear this a lot in the API security world of, first of all, discover your attack surface overall, what APIs you even have. So you're applying this in other areas of just understand your flows and how it all works together before you try to do anything. I think that's very cool.
Yeah, those
Okay.
API security tools are a little interesting. Many of them are just sort of a WAF plus DAST, which is
Yeah.
a strange combination of old technologies to me. But it's, API security is really critical because almost every application these days is all APIs on the server side. So it's something really important. I just think, traditional tools like traditional DAST, SAST, and IAST are the right way to address most API security issues.
Completely agree. All right, perfect. Well, we are at time. So thank you everybody for joining. You have all our contact details here. Feel free to reach out to us directly as individuals or follow the companies. I know that Bright Contrast are constantly sharing additional information regarding new trends, new vulnerabilities that are out there, etc. So if you want to learn more and stay up to date on what are we all doing around AI or LLM vulnerabilities or things like that, we're constantly pushing the envelope on those. Feel free to follow us and learn more. And we look forward to having you on the next webinar, or if you're coming out to RSA or any other conference, please stop by and we look forward to speaking with you in person. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day or night, depending where you are.